everyone. So today we're going to go through the president's greatest hits. We're going to do something specifically for students who benefit from reading and pausing while they go through. This is what the organizer looks like for you. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the part of the answer key. And we're going to go through this pretty quickly. So you will need to pause. You might be like, wait, I didn't get all this down, or I didn't check if my information is here. We just want to give you a little bit about each of the presidents and these major issues and a few others that you didn't have to take notes on. So this is going to be quick, but you will probably want to pause this video while we go through. Also, you have links to the Miller Center events in each president's presidency and within their life. So you could find many of these in different events throughout. Right, here's this Truman Doctrine speech. You can find these events throughout the Miller Center links or by watching this video. We'll also make a video for people who liked the visuals and the images more than the text. So let's do it. So President Harry Truman. The first thing you need to know is that Truman in 1948 issued Executive Order 9,981. And this ended segregation in the U.S. military. This was a big win for civil rights, even before the civil rights movement really picked up steam. And this executive order from the president directly ended segregation in the military. Then, when Harry Truman was up for re-election, he went up against three other major candidates. His Democratic Party split, and a Southern Democrat was running against Truman. So many people consider Truman a long shot to win this election. The headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman," refers to November 3rd incorrect headline published by the Chicago Tribune, where many newspapers had already assumed Truman was going to lose, the Republican Dewey would win. And of course, Truman did win re-election and then celebrated by posing with this newspaper saying Dewey defeats Truman. Next, in 1952, during the middle of the Korean War, about 500,000 steel workers tried to go on strike. And to prevent these steel mills from closing, Harry Truman nationalized steel mills around the country. He tried to take over the steel mills and steel plants, but the Supreme Court ruled this action was unconstitutional. Another major event was that the Second Red Scare really began in earnest during Truman's presidency. This fear of communism and this McCarthyism, witch hunt, accusations against communists, widespread investigations, and general paranoia around the country about who could be a communist and who is not. Okay, so you could probably pause here, go to your document, make sure you have some of this information, and we're going to keep going with Eisenhower in a minute. Next, Dwight Eisenhower is a Republican candidate. He is a war hero from World War II, and the Second Red Scare continues into Eisenhower's administration. Senator Joseph McCarthy is still a powerful figure until in 1954, there are the Army McCarthy hearings. These are televised hearings that really expose McCarthy for his aggressive tactics, revealing that he has no serious evidence about these accusations he's been making about communists in the military. And this leads to McCarthy's censure, eventually him losing office and fading away from the scene. Another major effort that Eisenhower's administration is known for is appointing Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Earl Warren is a very progressive judge. He's going to lead the Warren Court in many Supreme Court cases, like the Brown versus Board of Education case, the Miranda rights case, and many other cases that expand civil rights and human rights throughout the United States. The Federal Highway Act is in 1956. Eisenhower signs a bill authorizing the construction of the interstate highway system, like I-95 and others. There's a major lasting impact on America's travel. Also in Eisenhower's administration is the Little Rock Nine. This is when 9 African American students tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, but were blocked by the Arkansas governor and National Guard troops. So President Eisenhower sent in federal troops to escort the African American students to school in support of integration. Alaska and Hawaii also became states, not territories any longer, during Eisenhower's administration. But the last thing you should know is that when Eisenhower was leaving office in January 1961, he gave his farewell address where he warned against the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. This idea that America's government, military, and industries were too caught up in one another, forming a bad habit of the government prioritizing defense spending and defensive industries more than they ought to. Okay, again, you should pause at the end of each president, check it out, take some notes, but we're going to keep going. JFK is a Democratic president elected in 1960. He becomes president because there are the first televised TV debates in September 1960 between him and Richard Nixon. JFK looks very good during these debates, very calm and collected, and enhances JFK's image and helps him win the presidency. You should remember from the Cold War many of the JFK events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the construction of the Berlin Wall. JFK is also the president for a lot of the space race. He is really like the face of the space race, calling on America to send more to send more science research, to spend more money on science research and missile programs for space exploration, ultimately culminating with a man on the moon in 1969. In addition to his belief in domino theory and the Vietnam War, you should know that JFK was a major proponent of civil rights. Martin Luther King's March on Washington and I Have a Dream speech take place during Kennedy's presidency. Kennedy was a civil rights activist who wanted to sign many of the legislation and amendments that you'll see in Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Those were some initiatives under Kennedy. But then in November of 1963, Kennedy is assassinated while driving in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. And his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is assassinated just 2 days later, leading to Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, taking office. Lyndon Johnson is remembered for his Great Society program. These were programs like the New Deal to improve life around America, quality of life, especially by decreasing poverty and giving support for people who were in need. So Medicaid and Medicare were two major elements of the Great Society programs. Medicare being federal programs for people who are over 65, and Medicaid being state-based programs based on how much income someone has to pay their medical bills. In addition to these Great Society programs, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a major landmark legislation outlawing discrimination, not just based on race or sex, but also, hang on, I lost my notes here, but also on skin color, religion, and national origin. So it doesn't matter where you're from or what you look like. You shouldn't be discriminated in America. This civil rights legislation is a major component. You should know it for the Regent's essays in detail. And again, this was a JFK initiative that Lyndon Johnson signed. Also in the Johnson administration is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is authorization for President Johnson to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It really expanded LBJ's presidential military powers. The 24th Amendment was an outlawing of poll taxes at federal elections. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, in addition to outlawing state and local poll taxes, also outlaws the literacy tests nationwide. sets up federal monitors for state elections, and expands the right to vote in America. Lyndon Johnson also passes the Immigration and Nationality Act in October 1965. This abolished the national origins quota system. It diversified U.S. immigration. There still will be a limit on how many immigrants can come to the United States, but it's not a race-based country of origin quota system like had taken place in the early 1900s. But of course, protests against the Vietnam War and growing criticism of the Vietnam War is what forced Lyndon Johnson to not seek re-election in 1968 and try to pass the baton to future Democrats who don't get elected. It's going to be Republican Richard Nixon. Again, you should pause, go back up to the parts on Johnson if you need. For Richard Nixon, you should know about Vietnamization. This is foreign policy, but it's also reducing the amount of American troops in the Vietnam War. Vietnamization is really removing American troops from the Vietnam War and negotiating with the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong for peace, but also stepping up airstrikes in Cambodia and Laos and North Vietnam. While we take out our troops and turn over the fighting to the South Vietnamese, we are still using the military and Air Force. You should also maybe make a note of the War Powers Act. This is going to mean that the president must notify Congress and return troops within 90 days or have congressional support for troops overseas. This will be an issue throughout later presidencies too. In addition to detente and efforts with the Soviet Union, the Vietnam War protests continue in the Nixon administration. For example, the Kent State shootings are a violent clash between protesters, including college protesters, and the Ohio National Guard. 4 students are killed at this one of the most important and tragic of the Vietnam War protests. Nixon also creates the Environmental Protection Agency. This is a new cabinet agency headed by a new cabinet administrator that Nixon takes to tackle environmental problems. Also, Nixon's administration is plagued by the Watergate scandal. After the break-in of the Democratic Party's national headquarters in D.C. and a cover-up of this break-in, the Watergate scandal evolves into a quagmire that Nixon cannot escape. There are demands for his personal tapes in the Oval Office to be divulged, and they eventually are through the Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Nixon. Richard Nixon ends up resigning and resulting in a significant lack of trust in the president, and also meaning that former Vice President Gerald Ford takes the presidency. There's also stagflation during Nixon's presidency. This is a stagnant economy. The economy is not growing. Companies are not profiting. And at the same time, there is higher inflation, right? So the prices are going up, but it's not just because the economy is doing better or producing more goods. There's stagnation and stagflation. And this is going to be a major economic bugaboo for not just Nixon, but future presidents too. You should also maybe make a note of the Pentagon Papers. These Pentagon Papers were documents released during the Nixon administration showing that the American government had tried to provoke and get itself involved in the Vietnam War more than they had owned up to, decreasing further Americans' trust in the government. Okay, next we have Gerald Ford. So after Nixon is out of office, Ford, who was neither elected as the vice president nor the president, is the president anyway, and he pardons Richard Nixon. He excuses Nixon from being the subject of a criminal trial. This gets Nixon off the hook, but also creates further distrust in the government. Gerald Ford also has this amnesty for draft dodgers, people who had avoided the Vietnam War draft, either leaving the country or going into hiding, were technically criminals. So Ford's draft dodger amnesty proclaimed that people who avoided the draft during the Vietnam War could come out of hiding. People who deserted the military while serving would not be severely punished. And people who had left the country to avoid the Vietnam War could also come back without fear of being arrested. In addition, Gerald Ford wanted to win or whip inflation now. This was a plan by the Ford administration to really go after combating inflation through public action. Inflation and the oil crisis was a major issue in Ford's presidency. Next, Democrat Jimmy Carter is elected in 1976. He becomes president in 1977. And one international achievement is the Camp David Accords. President Carter brokers a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, resulting in better relationships between nations in the Middle East, and carving out a role for America and Israel and other countries in the Middle East going forward. But Carter's presidency is also plagued by other issues. He has this national energy policy because there's an economic recession. There are still ongoing issues in oil shortages. Oil and gasoline are being limited to the population. There's also a nuclear meltdown at the 3 Mile Island plant in March of 1979. And this creates a lot of issues that Carter's presidency has to tackle with. If the nuclear energy is not safe and the oil energy is too expensive, what are we going to do? This leads to a crisis of confidence. This is really like a general feeling throughout America that America is like losing its mojo. I know it's not a technical term, but right, like there's really like a lack of confidence and lower nationalism in America. This is about like American businesses, American trust in the government, and Carter himself doesn't really help matters very much. He is a likable individual, but when he goes and tells a reporter, "I was attacked by a rabbit," and then people are reading a news headline, "President attacked by rabbit," this is going to exacerbate this crisis of confidence. So Carter's like wanted to acknowledge this. He has his malaise speech, or Carter gives a speech about the general bad feeling of malaise in America, or this crisis of confidence. And there's also an Iranian hostage crisis. During Carter's presidency, towards the end, there is a revolution in Iran, and Carter's refusal to negotiate with the Iranians or give up the former leader of Iran to the revolutionaries really means that these 52 Americans are held hostage for over 440 days in Iran. This like around the clock, 365-day plus crisis really puts a stain on Carter's presidency. Along with these economic crises, it leads to Ronald Reagan being elected president in 1980. So Reagan's presidency, there's a lot more than this, but Reaganomics is this economic policy promoting tax cuts, deregulation, and promoting free market capitalism so that the economy can bust out of this malaise and this slump. The supply side economics is really an attempt to reduce corporate taxes and to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes to stimulate investment. There's also the war on drugs, or Just Say No. This was First Lady Nancy Reagan's initiative to address drug use in America and also create a foreign policy critical of countries that were soft on drugs, or government intervention and military intervention in countries like Panama, where drugs were flowing into the United States. There was also the PATCO strike, or the air traffic controllers strike, in November of 1981. Air traffic controllers wanted to go on strike, but this would paralyze America's airports, so they were fired by President Reagan. He basically said, "You can get back to work, or you're fired. The Star Wars Initiative is also Cold War defense spending. The Iran-Contra is another scandal that hurts Reagan's administration. And then President George H.W. Bush comes to power. So take a pause. George H.W. Bush has the American with Disabilities Act. This mandates easier access to employment and access to public facilities for people with disabilities and handicaps. It also prohibits discrimination based on disability. It really adds Americans with disabilities to the list of Americans who need their civil rights protected. There's also Operation Desert Storm, or the Persian Gulf War. In response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the Middle East, this Operation Desert Storm sees the United States and United Nations liberating Kuwait from Iraqi control. And this short but definitive war helps cement America's legacy as a world police, or getting involved in humanitarian crises. The Cold War also officially ends under George Bush. That's when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. You can give credit to Reagan and others as well here. But then you also have something that comes back to haunt George H.W. Bush, which is in 1998, when he was running for president, he'd promised, read my lips, no new taxes. But Bush raised taxes and signed legislation increasing taxes in 1990 anyway. This resulted in a lack of trust and campaign scrutiny that Bush couldn't overcome. He is defeated by Democrat Bill Clinton, who takes office in 1993. One initiative that Bill Clinton has is the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. This allowed people of different sexualities to remain in the military and not face different like scrutiny or investigation, but only if they didn't come out. So if someone was in the military, they didn't openly state their sexuality, they were fine. But if they came out, they would be removed from the military. And this Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was removed 11 years later. Clinton's administration also saw a series of United States and UN interventions in the Balkans, in Kosovo and Bosnia. There's also a humanitarian crisis in Rwanda that's answered. You studied all that in Global, didn't you? And there's also the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. NAFTA is going to reduce tariffs or trade barriers between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and it's going to encourage these three countries to participate in a more global economy. NAFTA is going to not be a long-term success. And Clinton also then signs in 1996 an overhaul of the welfare system. This welfare reform bill, or often called the Welfare to Work bill, it increases federal welfare given to states, but ties welfare payments to seeking jobs. It really encourages people to find a job and limits welfare to a temporary solution. So, and much of this is still in the welfare programs today. Then Bill Clinton has his own scandal, his impeachment scandal. He lies under oath. So he is impeached for perjury and obstruction of justice. He wins his acquittal in the Senate and stays in office, even though he is impeached for his affair and lying about his affair with intern Monica Lewinsky. During the Clinton years, there's also a budget surplus. There is an excess of income over expenditures, although there are ways of showing that this is a temporary measure. There's a really great economy during Bill Clinton's presidency. So in addition to some smart budget maneuvers, the booming economy allows Clinton's government to collect taxes. And for a short time in Clinton's presidency, the American government has a budget surplus. But the economy and budgets come back down to earth in George W. Bush's presidency. It's important to know that this presidential election of 2000 is really contested. Al Gore and George Bush really fight to the last vote. It ultimately comes down to the state of Florida, where a recount and government investigations and a Florida Supreme Court rule that Bush does win the electoral vote, even though he doesn't win the popular vote. It's a tightly contested election. Then there is 9/11. The war on terror really begins with the terrorist attacks on Washington, D.C. and New York City on September 11, 2001. And America will be involved in military operations around the world, especially in Afghanistan and later again in Iraq. There's also the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is going to give authorities enhanced powers to collect intelligence, collect information from phone calls, emails, library records in order to combat terrorism. But this is going to prove controversial because not all of the data collected under the Patriot Act is going to be about terrorism. And what happens to your records that are collected under the Patriot Act? Well, you should find that out yourself. Another George W. Bush initiative is No Child Left Behind. January 2002, there's major education reform passed aimed at improving student performance. The onus is on the schools. School districts will get report cards. School districts that don't do well on certain federal tests will have funding and other programs limited. There's also a housing crash and a recession in 2007. And then we're going to leave George Bush's presidency behind for Barack Obama's. In addition to continued operations in Afghanistan and eventually a decrease of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, Obama passes the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in January 2009. This strengthens protections against pay discrimination against women, really trying to make punishments cumulative for passing over women for promotions or discriminatory practices against women in the workplace. There's also Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act from 2010. This was a major health reform law expanding healthcare access and coverage. It sets up a private marketplace where vendors and insurance companies can sell insurance plans to the public as an alternative or a supplement to private insurance programs. For Donald Trump and Joe Biden, you should choose and do some research yourself. And let us know what you thought of this video. We will have another video soon with the visuals from the slides in class. But for the people who like the text, here you are, and hope you found it useful. All right. Take care.